Luchino Visconti's The Damned stands as one of cinema's most haunting portraits of power and moral decay. But what if the film's greatest achievement isn't the story it tells on screen? It's the layer of meaning woven into every frame that most viewers never catch. What if the performances, the staging, even the colors themselves are speaking a second language, one that transforms the entire film once you learn to read it? Let's pull back the curtain on the choices that made The Damned more than a period drama. Let's uncover the detail that changes how you see it. The architecture of collapse. The Damned operates on two levels simultaneously, and understanding this is the key to everything that follows. On the surface, it's the story of the Essenbeck family, German industrialists whose steel fortune makes them indispensable to the rising Nazi regime in the 1930s. We watch as family members betray one another, as a mother manipulates her son, as power corrupts absolutely. But Visconti constructed something far more intricate. The film functions as an elaborate moral X-ray, where every visual choice, every performance decision, every staging of a scene creates a parallel narrative about complicity itself. The director wasn't just showing us characters who make terrible choices, he was building a cinematic language to explore how human beings rationalize the unthinkable. We tell ourselves stories that make collaboration with evil seem not just acceptable, but necessary. How we perform goodness while committing atrocities. This hidden architecture reveals itself through three interlocking pillars. The visual grammar of corruption, where Visconti uses color and composition to chart moral descent before the characters themselves consciously acknowledge it. The performance philosophy he demanded from his actors, which required them to embody both the persona and the awareness of that persona's falseness. And the historical metaphor embedded in every sequence, where a family's collapse mirrors Germany's own descent into fascism with surgical precision. Most fans watch The Damned and see an operatic tragedy. They're not wrong, but they're missing the diagnostic precision underneath, the way Visconti turned cinema itself into a tool for understanding how civilizations fall. A Palace on the Edge. The film premiered in 1969, emerging into a world still wrestling with questions about fascism, about how ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary evil. Visconti had lived through Mussolini's Italy, fought with the resistance. He understood collaboration not as an abstract concept, but as a lived reality, something that happened in drawing rooms and boardrooms, in families, and between friends. He chose to set his exploration in 1933 Germany, the year Hitler consolidated power, and to anchor it in a family of industrialists whose wealth depends on steel production. The Essenbecks aren't Nazis, not initially. They're pragmatists. Businessmen. They tell themselves they're simply navigating difficult times, making the compromises necessary to protect their interests, their workers, their legacy. The Damned was Visconti's first film in color, and he approached that color like a language with its own syntax. He'd spent years shooting in black and white, and the shift wasn't a concession to commercial trends. It was a calculated artistic choice. Color would allow him to chart corruption visually, to use reds and golds and sickly greens as markers of moral decay. The Essenbeck mansion becomes a chromatic map of the family's descent, each room color-coded to represent different stages of compromise. The production brought together an international cast: Dirk Bogarde as the family confidant Friedrich, Ingrid Thulin as the matriarch Sophie, a young Helmut Berger as Sophie's son Martin. Visconti demanded months of preparation, asking his actors to understand not just their characters, but the philosophical questions those characters embodied. This wasn't going to be a conventional historical drama. It was going to be something closer to a thesis rendered in flesh and celluloid, and it would cost everyone involved more than they initially understood. 3. The performer's burden. Dirk Bogarde arrived at The Damned as an established star, known for both commercial films and more serious work. But Visconti asked him to do something that went beyond conventional acting. Friedrich, the character Bogarde plays, is a man performing morality while orchestrating murder. He's the family's trusted advisor, the voice of reason, and simultaneously the architect of their destruction. Bogarde later described the role as requiring him to inhabit two consciousnesses at once. The character Friedrich believes himself to be, and the man Friedrich actually is beneath that belief. In every scene, Bogarde had to show us Friedrich convincing himself of his own righteousness, while the audience sees the manipulation, the calculation, the rot. It's a high-wire act of self-deception made visible. Visconti pushed harder. He wanted Bogart to understand that Friedrich isn't a villain who knows he's a villain. He's a man who has constructed an elaborate internal narrative where every betrayal is justified, every murder is regrettable but necessary, every compromise is the realistic path. The horror isn't that Friedrich is evil, it's that he genuinely believes he's being reasonable. The public saw Bogart's performance and recognized brilliance. What they didn't see was the psychological toll of spending months inside that kind of rationalization. Bogart had to make Friedrich's logic feel inevitable, even sympathetic, while never letting the audience lose sight of the moral catastrophe unfolding. He had to perform conviction while communicating hollowness. He had to make collaboration feel seductive and repulsive simultaneously. And he had to do it while Visconti demanded take after take, pushing him toward a place where the performance stopped feeling like performance and started feeling like exposure of something true, not just about Friedrich, but about the human capacity for self-deception itself. The cost of that kind of honesty? Bogart would later call it one of the most exhausting experiences of his career. Playing a man who believes his own lies requires you to understand how easily any of us might do the same. IV, the scene that rewrote everything. Principal photography was well underway when Visconti made a decision that fundamentally altered the film's trajectory. The script originally included a sequence where the family makes their first explicit pact with the Nazi regime in a formal meeting, a clear, dramatic moment where they cross the line from neutrality to collaboration. Visconti cut it. Instead, he restructured the film so the collaboration happens gradually, almost invisibly. There's no single moment where the Essenbecks become complicit. It happens in smaller decisions: a dinner invitation accepted, a business deal approved, a conversation where someone doesn't object loudly enough. Horror is diffuse, incremental, normalized. This wasn't a minor editing choice. It was a philosophical repositioning of the entire film. By eliminating the moment of compromise, Visconti was arguing that complicity doesn't work that way in real life. People don't wake up one morning and decide to collaborate with fascism. They make a series of smaller choices, each one individually justifiable, each one making the next choice easier, until they've walked so far down the path that turning back seems impossible. The restructuring meant rewriting dialogue, reshooting sequences, recalibrating performances. Actors who had built their characters around that single pivotal scene now had to distribute the moral collapse across dozens of smaller moments. The technical crew had to rethink lighting and composition to support this new diffuse approach. Instead of a dramatic descent, they needed to create a gradual dimming, a slow shift in the visual palette that audiences would feel without consciously recognizing. The decision transformed The Damned from a film about collaboration into a film about normalization, about how evil becomes ordinary through repetition, about the way moral erosion happens so gradually that people don't notice they've changed until it's far too late. And it made the film infinitely more disturbing because it made the Essenbeck's choices feel not monstrous but understandable, which is the most frightening thing of all. V. Behind the opulent. The Essenbeck mansion looks like wealth incarnate on screen. Grand rooms, rich fabrics, elaborate dinners. But creating that opulence required a production that was grinding through logistical nightmares and budget pressures that threatened to shut everything down. Visconti was notorious for perfectionism, and on The Damned, that perfectionism manifested in demands that pushed the production to its limits. He insisted on period-accurate furnishings, on specific lighting setups that took hours to achieve, on rehearsals that continued until actors were exhausted. A single dinner scene might take 3 days to shoot as Visconti adjusted the placement of wine glasses, the angle of a chandelier, the exact hue of light falling across the table. This wasn't indulgence for its own sake. Visconti understood that the film's critique depended on making the Essenbeck's world feel lived in and real. If the mansion looked like a set, audiences would maintain critical distance. But if it felt like a place where real people actually conducted their lives, then the moral compromises would hit harder. The audience needed to feel the seduction of that world, its comfort, its beauty, its apparent stability, in order to understand how people might sacrifice their principles to preserve it. But the cost was real. Actors worked 14-hour days. The technical crew dealt with equipment failures, and the challenges of shooting in practical locations that weren't designed for film production. The budget swelled. Producers pressured Visconti to speed up, to compromise, to accept good enough instead of pursuing perfection. Helmut Berger, playing Martin, later described the experience as beautiful torture. The final film shows a young man's complete moral collapse, from troubled son to willing participant in atrocity. Getting there required Berger to access places most actors spend their careers avoiding. Visconti pushed him there scene by scene, take by take, refusing to settle for a performance that kept Martin safely in the realm of villain. He wanted something more uncomfortable, a character whose descent felt plausible, even inevitable. The physical production mirrors the film's theme. Creating the appearance of stability and beauty required chaos and struggle behind the scenes. The irony was intentional. VI. What lives in the frames? Most viewers watch the film's centerpiece sequence, the Night of the Long Knives massacre, reimagined through Visconti's lens, and see its obvious power. Register the violence, the betrayal, the way Martin fully commits to evil in that moment. But they miss three crucial details embedded in the sequence that completely reframe what they're watching. First, the color shift. In the scenes leading up to the massacre, Visconti keeps the palette relatively muted, browns, grays, dim golds. But as the violence begins, he introduces a sickly green tint that pervades the lighting. It's subtle enough that you don't consciously register it, but your body does. That green doesn't represent the violence itself. It represents Martin's perception in that moment. He's viewing the massacre through a filter of rationalization, and Visconti makes that psychological filter literal through color. The film is showing us not just what Martin does, but how he's processing what he does. Green is the visual equivalent of self-deception. Second, the mirror. Throughout the sequence, Visconti positions mirrors in frame so that we frequently see characters reflected rather than direct. Sometimes we see both the person and their reflection simultaneously. This wasn't an accident of production design. Visconti is literalizing the concept of performance. These characters are watching themselves commit atrocity, seeing themselves as they want to be seen rather than as they are. The mirrors create a doubling effect, where every action exists in two registers, the thing itself and the performed version the character tells themselves they're doing. Third, Martin's face in the aftermath. In the final shot of the sequence, Martin stares directly at camera for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to register, not long enough to feel like a deliberate break of the fourth wall. His expression is blank, not satisfied, not horrified, not anything. That blankness is the point. Visconti is showing us the complete evacuation of moral feeling, the moment when someone has rationalized so thoroughly that they can witness horror and feel nothing. It's perhaps the most chilling shot in the entire film, and most viewers don't even consciously register it because it looks like a simple reaction shot. These aren't hidden Easter eggs. They're fundamental to the film's meaning. Seventh, the studio's resistance. The Damned faced significant institutional pushback before it ever reached audiences, though the conflict played out differently than most studio battles. This wasn't a case of executives trying to soften the film or make it more commercial. The resistance was more fundamental, confusion about what the film even was. Warner Brothers, distributing in the United States, struggled with how to market a film that defied easy categorization. It was too dark and complex for the art house crowd expecting Visconti to deliver another lush period piece in the vein of The Leopard. It was too intellectually demanding for audiences looking for a straightforward World War II drama, and the film's frank depictions of sexuality and violence made it controversial in ways the marketing department didn't know how to navigate. The studio wanted Visconti to cut 20 minutes. Not specific scenes, just 20 minutes anywhere, to make the film more manageable for American theaters. Visconti refused. He argued that the film's impact depended on its cumulative weight, on the way it builds moral pressure, scene by scene, until the audience feels trapped in the Essenbecks world with no exit. Cutting 20 minutes would compromise the carefully calibrated pacing that made that pressure work. In Europe, the response was different, but equally fraught. Critics praised the film's artistry, but questioned its politics. Was Visconti arguing that fascism emerged from individual moral failure or from systemic conditions? Was the film's focus on a wealthy family representative or distorting? Did the operatic style romanticize the material or critique it? Visconti maintained that the questions themselves were the point. He wasn't making an argument. He was constructing a space where audiences had to grapple with complicity as a lived experience rather than an abstract concept. The film's refusal to provide easy answers was intentional. The discomfort was the message. But that kind of intellectual ambiguity made the film difficult to champion for institutions that needed clear narratives. It won prizes at major festivals, but it also sparked walkouts and heated debates. Some viewers called it a masterpiece. Others found it indulgent, too long, too ambiguous in its moral stance. The conflict reveals something crucial about how we process difficult art. The Damned asks audiences to sit with discomfort, to recognize their own capacity for the kind of rationalization the Essenbecks employ, to acknowledge that complicity isn't something that happens to other people in other times. That's a hard sell, especially when audiences go to movies looking for catharsis or escape. The film's commercial underperformance in 1969 wasn't a failure of marketing. It was a success of exactly what Visconti intended, a film that refuses comfort, that implicates rather than absolves, that makes you examine your own capacity for self-deception, instead of letting you maintain a safe distance from the characters on screen. 8. The mirror Visconti didn't expect. Here's the irony that became clear only in retrospect. Visconti set out to explore how aesthetes and intellectuals collaborated with fascism in 1930s Germany, and in doing so, he created a film that demonstrated how easily any of us, even those with the best intentions, can rationalize our own compromises. The Essenbecks tell themselves they're protecting their workers, preserving their heritage, navigating impossible circumstances. Each justification sounds reasonable in isolation. It's only when you see the full arc that the self-deception becomes obvious. But Visconti himself was making similar compromises throughout the production, pushing actors past their limits while telling himself it was necessary for the art, demanding perfection while creating an environment that left people exhausted, building something beautiful out of conditions that were frequently brutal. He wasn't blind to this. Visconti understood that the act of making a film about complicity required its own forms of compromise, with studios, with budgets, with human limitations. The parallels weren't lost on him. In interviews, he spoke about the film with a kind of weary self-awareness, acknowledging that creation always involves a degree of ruthlessness, and that the line between necessary rigor and exploitation is blurrier than anyone wants to admit. The second irony cuts even deeper. The Damned critiques wealthy industrialists who collaborate with fascism for profit, but the film itself was funded by those same kinds of industrial fortunes, distributed by corporate systems, made possible by capitalist infrastructure. Visconti, a committed Marxist, was using the tools of the system he opposed to create a film condemning that system. The contradiction is built into every frame. This doesn't invalidate the film. If anything, it deepens it. The Damned becomes most powerful when you understand it not as a lecture from outside the system, but as a self-examination from within. Visconti isn't standing in judgment above the Essenbecks. He's acknowledging his own position in analogous structures of power and compromise. The film that was supposed to be a historical diagnosis became an ongoing contemporary one. Every generation that watches it finds new parallels, not because the film changed, but because the mechanisms it explores are timeless. The rationalization, the incremental compromise, the belief that this time the ends justify the means, the stories we tell ourselves to make collaboration feel like pragmatism rather than betrayal. That's the irony no one saw coming in 1969. The Damned would remain relevant precisely because human beings never stop needing to believe they're the exception to the patterns they can clearly see in others. Recognition arrives slowly. The Damned didn't conquer the box office in 1969, but it achieved something more lasting. It changed how filmmakers approached historical material, how they thought about complicity as a cinematic subject, and how they used visual language to communicate psychological states. The critical reappraisal began almost immediately in Europe, where film journals devoted extensive analysis to Visconti's techniques. The discussion wasn't about whether the film was good in a conventional sense. It was about what the film made possible. Visconti had demonstrated that you could make moral philosophy cinematic, that you could explore ideas about complicity and self-deception not through dialogue, but through color, composition, and performance choices. Within 5 years, you could see The Damned's influence rippling through European cinema. Filmmakers began experimenting with similar approaches, using visual grammar to create psychological portraits, building historical narratives that emphasized gradual moral erosion rather than dramatic turning points, constructing films that implicated the audience rather than providing them with heroes to identify with. The specific technique of using color to represent psychological states rather than just physical reality became a recognized tool. Cinematographers studied how Visconti's use of that sickly green communicated Martin's rationalization without a single line of dialogue explaining it. Directors learned how to build performance spaces that required actors to inhabit multiple levels of consciousness simultaneously, the character's self-perception and the truth underneath. In America, the recognition came more slowly, but when it arrived, it was decisive. Film schools began teaching The Damned as a masterclass in visual storytelling. A generation of filmmakers who came of age in the 1970s and 1980s, Coppola, Scorsese, Cimino, absorbed Visconti's lessons about how to make psychological complexity visible, how to build films that worked on multiple registers simultaneously. The film's influence extends beyond technique into subject matter. Damned made complicity narratives viable in mainstream cinema. It demonstrated that audiences could handle moral ambiguity, that you didn't need to simplify history into heroes and villains, that the most disturbing stories are often the ones where we recognize ourselves in the antagonist. Watch the family dynamics in The Godfather, the moral erosion in Taxi Driver, the institutional corruption in The Deer Hunter. All of them carry DNA from The Damned. They understand that evil isn't a category some people belong to. It's a process anyone can enter through incremental choices that seem reasonable at the time. X, the ripples that never stop. The Damned transformed careers in ways that only became clear years later. Bogard, who arrived as a star, left with a new understanding of what acting could accomplish. He described the experience as fundamentally changing his relationship to performance, showing him that cinema could explore ideas with the same rigor as literature or philosophy, that an actor could work at the intersection of art and analysis. His subsequent career reflected that shift. He took fewer conventional roles, sought out projects that demanded psychological complexity, worked with directors who shared Visconti's commitment to using cinema as a tool for understanding rather than just entertainment. The performances that define his legacy, in Death in Venice, in The Night Porter, in Providence, all demonstrate the lessons learned on The Damned: how to make internal contradiction visible, how to perform self-deception, how to create characters who are simultaneously sympathetic and repellent. Helmut Berger's career took a different trajectory, but The Damned remained its defining achievement. Martin Essenbeck is an impossible role, a character who must be simultaneously victim and monster, seduced and seducer, destroyed by others and self-destroying. Berger made it work by refusing to ask the audience for forgiveness. He played Martin with a kind of cold precision that never apologized, never explained, never asked for understanding. That fearlessness became his trademark. For Ingrid Thulin, playing Sophie meant embodying maternal manipulation as a survival strategy. Her performance demonstrated how women navigate patriarchal power structures by developing forms of indirect control that are no less destructive for being subtle. Decades later, that performance remains a template for how to play female characters who wield power through channels society has taught them are their only option. Beyond individual careers, The Damned influenced how subsequent generations thought about historical film. It proved you could take a specific moment in time, Germany in 1933, and use it to explore universal patterns. The particulars matter: the steel industry, the Night of the Long Knives, the specific textures of that historical moment, but they matter because they're a case study in larger phenomena. Contemporary filmmakers dealing with complicity narratives, from There Will Be Blood to The Favorite to Succession on television, are working in territory the damned mapped. They understand that moral corruption is most effectively portrayed not through dramatic confrontations, but through accumulation, not through evil choices, but through rationalizations that sound almost reasonable. The film's visual strategies have become part of cinema's common vocabulary. The use of color to represent psychological states, the doubling effect of mirrors, the way composition can communicate moral positioning. These aren't Visconti's exclusive property anymore. They're techniques any filmmaker can use, part of the inherited language of the medium. But influence cuts both ways. As the damned's techniques became widely adopted, they also became easier to deploy superficially. You can use sickly lighting without understanding what it should communicate. You can stage scenes in front of mirrors without grasping the metaphorical weight. The danger of influence is always that the tools survive, but the philosophy behind them gets lost. That's why returning to the original remains essential. The Damned isn't just a collection of techniques. It's a coherent vision of what cinema can do when it commits to examining human nature with unflinching rigor. The influence matters most when it transmits not just the methods, but the commitment to using those methods in pursuit of truth. The human truth underneath. Strip away the period costumes, the Nazi context, the industrial Gothic grandeur, and the Damned is asking a single question: how do we live with the person we've become when that person isn't who we thought we were? Every character in the film faces this question differently. Friedrich convinces himself that he's the reasonable one, the pragmatist, making difficult choices in impossible circumstances. Sophie tells herself she's protecting her son while manipulating him toward destruction. Martin constructs an identity out of performing what he believes powerful men want him to be. And by the time he realizes the performance has become his reality, there's no one left underneath to return to. The genius of Visconti's approach is that he never lets us feel superior to these characters. The film's construction, its gradual erosion, its accumulation of small compromises, its refusal to provide clear moral markers, means we're always slightly unsure where the line is. We watch the Essenbecks make choices, and while we can see the trajectory they're on, it's never obvious exactly when they cross from morally gray to irredeemable. That uncertainty is the point, because that's how it works in real life. We don't get clear markers. We make decisions that seem justified in the moment, that serve our interest or protect people we love or advance causes we believe in. And sometimes those decisions accumulate into something we never intended. Sometimes we wake up and realize we've traveled far from who we meant to be, and we can't quite identify the moment when we took the wrong path. The Damned endures because it makes that process visible without making it comfortable. It shows us people engaged in active self-deception, people performing versions of themselves they want to believe in, people constructing narratives that let them live with their choices. And it does so with such precision, such psychological accuracy, that we can't help but recognize the mechanisms. The film becomes most powerful, not when it shows us the Essenbecks' choices, but when it makes us aware of our own capacity for the same rationalizations. When we catch ourselves sympathizing with Friedrich's pragmatism before remembering what that pragmatism enables. When we understand Sophie's impossible position even as we recoil from her manipulations. When we see how Martin's desperate desire for approval leads him step by incremental step toward monstrosity. This is why the hidden layer matters. The surface story, a family destroyed by their collaboration with fascism, is compelling enough, but the deeper structure reveals something universal about human psychology, about how we navigate moral complexity, about the stories we tell ourselves to maintain our self-concept even when our actions contradict it. Visconti understood that cinema's unique power lies in its ability to show us the gap between who we think we are and who we actually are. Film can do what literature and theater can't quite manage. It can show us a character's face, their performance, their mask, and simultaneously reveal what's underneath. It can make the gap itself visible. That's what changes when you understand what The Damned is really doing. You stop watching it as a historical drama about other people in another time and start experiencing it as a diagnostic tool, one that reveals the mechanisms we all employ. The colors that communicate self-deception, the mirrors that show performance, the gradual accumulation that normalizes the unthinkable. These aren't just about the Essenbecks in 1933. They're about how human beings work, how we work, how easily we slip from principle to compromise to rationalization to acceptance, how the person we become can surprise us because we weren't paying attention to the small choices that got us there. The invitation to see again. So watch The Damned again, but this time pay attention to what's happening underneath the plot. Notice the colors in each scene and how they shift as characters rationalize their choices. Watch for the mirrors and what they reveal about performance and self-perception. Track the accumulation of small compromises, the way each choice makes the next one easier. You'll discover a film that's been hiding in plain sight inside the one you thought you knew. A film that's not content to simply tell you a story, but insists on making you grapple with the philosophical questions embedded in its structure. A film that respects you enough to demand active engagement, to make you work for the insights rather than handing them to you. The hidden layer is there waiting for anyone who knows where to look. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that's when The Damned transforms from a well-crafted historical drama into something that stays with you, that changes how you think about moral complexity, that makes you more aware of your own rationalizations and the stories you tell yourself. What detail did you miss the first time you watched? What layer of meaning is waiting for you to discover? Watch again with fresh eyes and then come back and tell us what you found.